Welcome to the Peggy Smedley Show, the podcasting voice of IoT and digital transformation, with your host, Peggy Smedley.
Welcome back, viewers and listeners, to the second day of live streaming from Liveworx 2019. We have a big live, kind of a packed, day for you today. Today I'm joined with Bob Murphey, who's the Senior Vice President of Connected Enterprise Consulting for Rockwell Automation. There's been so much going on here at Liveworx 2019 with PTC. I have been talking to so many amazing people here, been walking around the show. It's been great. Bob, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, Peggy.
So, Bob, you and I have been sitting this morning just talking and just getting a glimpse of everything. And it's been fun getting to know you a little bit more and finding out how long you've been at Rockwell. And it's been interesting. Before it was Rockwell, and they merged with Allen Bradley. You know, it's kind of admitting that you and I are kind of the old-timers of all of this, being around in this technology space for a while. But it's been kind of fun, right? Getting to see the evolution of it all, right?
Absolutely. I think the dynamic of what all's happening in the ecosystem of the industrial Internet of Things, it's been refreshing, even for us longer in toothers, right? In the industry, it affords us a new window into new possibilities and enabling technologies that I think a lot of us are having fun leveraging.
I think when we've been around for a while, we're actually getting younger. I think the younger people coming in don't realize they're catching up to us. We're the ones getting younger. They have to realize that right now.
Well, that's what I tell them anyway.
We're like fine wine. They just don't realize it. So let's talk about what's been going on. You guys have been doing some really great things and a really great partner to PTC. Talk a little bit about the last 5 years. Companies have really been able to go beyond the hype that's going on in this space. And I think that's what's really interesting, because there's a lot of IoT projects out there. And I think what's interesting when we talk about IoT and what's happening is the industry as a whole successfully achieving what they want in reinventing itself or engaging in the solutions that they want.
Peggy, I think we in the industry are on our way. To say we've arrived, I don't think we'll ever get there, because the game just continues to change. But why I think we're legitimately on our way is that our customers, those we engage with, are more so thinking about what's important from an outcome perspective. I think so much of the early flash of IoT was around the technologies. Very shiny objects, very cool, very enabling. But in part, I think industry sort of looked at them as something to acquire, something to behold, even as though they were an end in mind. And they're not. Every one of them is an enabling capability to a much bigger, more important end in mind, which is the aspiration of the company. Are they trying to get faster at time to market? Are they trying to get better from an overall quality perspective and how their image is portrayed in that regard? Are they trying to reduce lead times? Are they trying to be more predictable and reliable? Those are the outcomes and aspirations that all these enabling technologies in the sphere of the IoT ecosystem enable. And so over the last 5 years, what I've seen through a lot of really good, honest discussion and frankly, missteps within industry, I think we're figuring out that pursuing the enabling technologies for themselves is, in and of itself, it's a misstep. Pursuing them as a means to an end to get to these outcomes and these aspirations is what's important. And at Rockwell, we're having those discussions far more intently with our customers. And of course, they lead to the enabling technologies, whether it's things we afford in terms of products and solutions, or incredible partners like PTC affords, or the blend of us together with co-innovation, or others in our partner network. That's where it becomes valuable, right?
It's interesting you talk about the shiny objects, because when we think about how over time, when we first started talking about M2M or the Internet of Things, and you know that, so much has come and gone when we talk about that shiny object. Do you think companies and manufacturers have settled down to understand where the right journey needs to be now and understand where the right investments then need to be? Because that's an interesting point that you say about finding the right partners, because that's critical in the success along the journey, because you mentioned the end, and there is no end.
No.
It's always finding the right path, and it requires the right partners.
Right. And you know, one of the things I think we're seeing along with this maturity of how all these plays are acting out is that customers know they have to have a reliance upon partners. But what they're not interested in is having to create an ecosystem of, say, 20 partners to deliver a transformational experience. It's unwieldy, and in fact, from just a logistics perspective, it's probably a spiral of death, right? It just can't be supported. So I think companies are looking for few, more capable, more broadly aware and engaging partners to be the trusted associates with them along their journey, right? And in terms of the solutions that go along with that, I think you're right. I think the weed is getting separated from the chaff. The things that are more important are rising to the surface, and they're the ones that are really being stood up as the sort of the compulsory things that companies need to consider in terms of enabling technologies. Let me give you an example. Let's say the shiny object was something like augmented reality, incredibly powerful, real, capable, here today, adding values for companies. But even a technology like augmented reality requires an infrastructure from a network topology standpoint. If it's blended off of getting data from the shop floor, imagine that data's got to come from somewhere. It's got to be piped in. There has to be a viable infrastructure. So when you think of companies maturing in their consideration of what all is required, they're recognizing that if I'm going to ingest data so that I can analyze it and then leverage it in an augmented sense, somewhere I have to have an enabling foundation that allows that to exist, that allows that to sustain. And I think we're just growing up and figuring that out more so that the roadmap to transformation is more legitimate, it's more viable.
So when we talk about the real impact of technologies, we have to really understand the underlying infrastructure, the underlying platforms that are going to enable all of these IoT that we talk about, whatever it is, that whether it's the digital transformation that we're talking about today, there's got to be an underlying ecosystem that enables all this to happen.
That's right. And it's not only with the right partners that have the right bandwidth of consideration and domain expertise. I think part of that underlying fabric that we're recognizing has to be involved in these journeys is a organizational structure and competency to be ready for transformation. In some instances, roles and responsibilities have to change. In some instances, those that are leading the charge have to step up and be more visible than they were in the past. We're hearing these roles surfacing in industry, like the chief digital officer, right? The chief transformational agent. These are new roles in industry, relatively new, in the past 2 to 3 years. And what we're finding is people that are getting put into these roles, they're invariably coming from either the IT space in corporations or the OT space. But these transformations are about where IT and OT are converging. So in most instances, the people that are put into these roles are looking for some added support, some added awareness and coaching on how does IT and OT converge, and what all do they need to think about, right?
We're talking a lot about change management there, and that's a really important part of this. So what are the common mistakes then organizations in manufacturing are making right now? I mean, is it that they're not thinking about change management, or are there other things that are the big mistakes that they're making?
I think there are other things. I think thinking about change management is paramount, though. When we're talking about transformation, particularly digital transformation, three terms usually surface: people, process, and technology.
Yeah, we've been hearing a lot about that in this whole conference.
Absolutely. But, I would say the majority of the conversation goes to technology. There's a good bit about the enabling processes, right, that leverage that technology. And there's, from my vantage point anyways, far too little meaningful conversation about the people, the cultural, the change management implications. So I think that's really important. The other thing from a potential misstep, and what we're seeing as maybe a problem in the evolution of some folks' transformations is this, McKinsey refers to it as pilot purgatory. And that's,
we've been hearing a lot about that as well.
Well, and that phrase is so perfectly dubbed in that our view of that is, if you think about it, digital transformation, again, it's a means to an end of enabling productivity, service, time to market. And with all of that, you have to affect the enterprise, not just a pilot. So I think what happens is there's this penchant to want to prove out a concept, right? So there are these POCs, there are these pilots, and there's nothing wrong with those as a starting point. At Rockwell, we prefer to talk to them, though, as initial deployments as opposed to pilots. When we hear the term pilot, we think of something that it might work, it might not work.
Right.
And these enabling technologies in the ecosystem of the Internet of Things, in our view, they are proven. They're substantiated. The trick is, how do you weave them together from an enablement standpoint, from a digital roadmap perspective? So if you begin with that end in mind of, I want to create an enterprise-wide transformation, I want to take this initial deployment and I need to extend it across the enterprise if I'm going to get the value, it changes the outcome entirely. These pilots are turning into hobbies. They're turning into pursuits of perfection, right? So folks are taking that deployment on a machine or on one line or maybe in one whole plant, Peggy, and they're working to perfect it before they extend it and scale it to the enterprise. And here's simply what's wrong with that. One machine, one line, one plant invariably is not going to change the P&L trajectory of a company.
Yeah, they're not going to make the money, right?
They're not going to make the money.
So what are you suggesting that they do differently to achieve success based on this? Because that's not where they're going to make the profit. That's not where they're going to have success overall,
right,
long term.
Right. So what we're working with customers to try and engage in is a view from the beginning of where you're trying to get to, which is why, again, what outcomes are important. But let's literally talk about transformationally what sort of a roadmap is going to be required to enable those aspirations from the beginning to the end, which includes...
So looking at what your long-term outcome is, what
right,
you're saying,
Peggy,
ultimately.
with an intentionality, right? So you set your vision for, I want to create enterprise value in time to market. I want to create enterprise value in new productivity, where you want to get to.
Okay.
And what is it going to take plant by plant, process by process to get there? And if the whole organization is aware from the beginning what the roadmap is, what the steps and stages are, then you can support this intentionality of what it's going to take to get there.
So you're actually having them look at what ultimately is going to be the payback. You're saying, let's look at how the outcome's going to be for these IoT projects. So a company actually sees the end in mind when they're looking at this.
Peggy, we think they need to. Let's face it, these enabling technologies are not purchased on the markdown rack, right? Some of these are costly engagements, right? And if all that NRE is consumed in only a pilot, that's onerous, right?
Yeah.
That cost center, that particular program is overly burdened, and it's not until you begin to extend that effect into the enterprise to where that ROI happens. So we do talk very, very tangibly about the end in mind return on investment is when the enterprise engages in these rollouts, in these enabling technologies, and we think from a transparency standpoint and from an ethic perspective, we should talk about what that end in mind possibility is up front.
So for some of them, that can be pretty scary, though. I mean, we're not talking about a very inexpensive investment. We're talking about something that's talking about multiple facilities in some cases, when Rockwell's talking about the companies they're going to.
Right.
And so for some, they might say, we're getting involved in IoT, and looking at the end in mind can be a very costly endeavor. And let's be honest about that. But if you have a plan of attack, the outcome can be very lucrative, can be very successful. And this is what you're saying a little differently than what others are saying with the vision in this case, right?
Absolutely. If all they're staring at is the initial cost to enter without the ultimate returns, then that causes some people to turn and run, and it actually ought to. But if they're able to connect the dots of ultimately what value is going to be derived in what facets of the corporate P&L statement, then suddenly it becomes far more intriguing and far more engaging. I think the onus is on providers like Rockwell, PTC, and others in the ecosystem to declare what should that return look like. And I think early on in the journey of IoT, too many of those returns were commented on as, in 3 to 5 years, you're going to be happy. Companies aren't that patient anymore. They need to see returns on these investments that get them positive within a year. And that's very achievable, it's very capable, but it gets back to that degree of intentionality. If in that first year all we did was enact enabling technology in a line or in a plant, well, that might not be the great year that you're looking for. But if it's on 4 lines or 3 plants, for example, suddenly you're net positive within a year, and then you begin to print money from a return on that investment post that, right? So beginning with that declaration and that intentionality, from an ROI perspective, we think makes all the difference.
You have to help them then understand that people, process, technology in order to achieve that return on investment within a year. It's not only just the technology, it's all 3 of those to effectively accomplish digital transformation. Isn't that correct?
You said it perfectly. What can happen is, for example, if it's just a technology discussion, they can get to 9 months in that first year, and suddenly they've hit the roadblock of culture, the roadblock of people and change management in the organization, and that in and of itself can create a total timeout, right, on that intentionality to return that investment. Whereas if those considerations of process and people along with the technology are well thought of up front, then the game plan for when the return is going to happen can be viable. But to your point, the people, the process and technology components need to be considered effectively up front in the journey, not when you get to them later on.
So we're wrapping up right now, but you know what I'd love to hear, Bob? Quickly, you're going to be on stage here and talk. Tell everybody what you're going to be talking about.
Sure. This topic, quite honestly, it's about how industry is upon the journey of digital transformations. We're going to talk about some things that we think are enabling in terms of getting transformations up and going. We're going to talk about some of these potential pitfalls that cause for stalls, right, that can cause people to enter into that pilot purgatory. And we're going to try and honestly just encourage folks along the way. It doesn't matter whether you're starting small or whether you're halfway there or whether you think you're at the finish line. There are things you need to consider and contemplate to make sure that you get where you want to go. And to your point, that's a never-ending journey, but we're going to talk about some of the ways and means to get there, in part by our own internal journey of connectivity and the conversations that we're having with customers, because we're learning just as much from them and the ecosystem of providers and partners like PTC.
Well, we know if you're here today or if you want to see the live stream, you can watch Bob today. Bob Murphey, Senior Vice President, Connected Enterprise Consulting, Rockwell Automation. Thank you so much for joining me. Well, stick around, viewers. We've got more to come right here from Liveworx and PTC. As you can see, this has been great, and we enjoyed. Stick around. We've got Kathleen Mitford, who's going to join me right here. As always, this is the Peggy Smedley Show, the podcasting voice of IoT and digital transformation. And remember, with great technology comes great responsibility. We'll be right back after this quick break.